Welcome back to the EPS Podcast, where everything is a primary source. I'm your host, Eric Paul. And today, once again, I have Kyle with me, and we are going to be discussing the TV series Seinfeld. So this was at your suggestion. It was not something that I at all resisted, because it is one of my all-time favorite shows and therefore worthy of analysis. But what made you choose Seinfeld?
Man, Seinfeld was like my life as an early teenager. Watched it every week on Thursday nights, which is tonight, by the way.
Yeah.
And man, I just remember watching that religiously for all 9 seasons. And when it was over, I was heartbroken. But it became a part of my life every day. Like just quoting it, dressing like Kramer, and doing all the wacky stuff and just saying, hey, what's with that? But now, so like, it's fresh in my mind because I just had a bout of COVID. So I found myself doing that quarantine thing for 14 days.
Oh, wow.
And Netflix saved me. It was like, oh yeah, Seinfeld, let's do that. So right again from season 1, episode 1, we hopped.
And in those days, when it first aired, it was called the Seinfeld Chronicles, right? And they had to change the name because they were afraid it was too similar to another program at the time. But it's when you go back to watching those first couple episodes of Seinfeld, it was already pretty clear that it was a different kind of show, that it wasn't like everything else on TV at the time in the late 80s.
It started with some stand-up comedy from Jerry Seinfeld, and he would go off on this bit and then boom, right into the show. Usually starting in Monk's diner or his apartment.
And it's the simplicity of the show that it held on for a while. It wasn't really until the later seasons that they started to do more of their program in, different, not exotic locations, but, all day at a car dealership or,
the parking garage.
Yeah, that one's a great one, because, and I think this feeds directly into the very first question when analyzing anything as a primary source. And if we take the entire series of Seinfeld, the first question is, what material is this made from? And it's actually, I think when I talked to you last time about of all things, the Mortal Kombat movie, I mentioned how, in my mind, when I see that, what material is this made from, I think of Jerry Seinfeld specifically, not just any comedian, but Jerry Seinfeld specifically saying, that's my material, and that like kind of, he's told, and who's that comedian that he calls a hack, that gives him the suit.
Yes,
Kenny Bania, and he's like, it's gold, Jerry, it's gold. So the material,
crazy Joel Tallulah,
yeah, and Joey, one of my, and so when I think about this, the material of this program was based on the comedy stylings of one Mr. Jerry Seinfeld and another being Larry David. And both of them had a career, kind of by the late 80s, they had both been, fairly well known in the stand-up comedy routine, the, what do you call it? The circuit, especially in New York. And Jerry had been on the Tonight Show the year before, and had become, or a couple of years before, they'd made themselves known. And what do you make of both he and Larry David's style of humor? How do you think that is, how could you use their style of humor that carries over into the TV show to tell us something about 1980s America and our society and our culture?
It's situational comedy, right? Like, everything's about trying to understand why people do the things that they do. And I think that's very reminiscent of the decade of the 90s, like we discussed previously. in the Mortal Kombat podcast is that everything in the 90s was everybody was trying to figure out what the hell was going on,
because
and
we
what
had
was
to,
going to happen in the future.
and I feel like it's reflective of a increasing amount of leisure time that we had. Thanks in
Yeah.
large part to technology in the workplace, technology in schools and at home. Just making life easier for us so that we could, kick back and relax. That a Thursday night
And
was it was sort of like the beginning of the weekend, even though you had a full day of school or work the next day on Friday. Thursday night was a
yeah,
great
but it
time.
was Friday, right? Like nothing
Yeah,
happens
who
on
yeah, who
Friday.
cares on Friday? You can kind of kick back a little bit on Friday. You're not, too worried about that. And I think that attitude, definitely takes hold in that era. And throughout the 90s, Seinfeld played a huge role in making people feel that way about Thursdays.
Yeah.
Because it became, before that, Cheers was on Thursdays. I don't know. I think Cosby might have been on Thursday. It was the most prime time of prime time. Nobody watches prime time
Absolutely.
on Saturday. Everybody's out and
No.
about on Saturdays.
Yeah, doing
Um,
things.
Friday was, that had long been taken over by ABC with their lineup of,
Oh,
TGIF
all in the
Fridays.
what was it? Yeah, I'm
They
trying to
had
remember all
Family
those names
Matters, there
now.
was Full House, there was
Urkel and all
Perfect
that stuff. Yeah.
Strangers, and that demographic. The family, and my family, we watched those pretty religiously every Friday. It was pizza and Urkel. Was the on the menu. But Thursday was must see TV, and I don't think they really started calling that until Seinfeld really caught on.
Right.
But so if there was ever a time that people outside of comedy nightclubs were ready for that kind of dry sense of humor of just like figuring out all those little idiosyncrasies of people, and it was
Well,
that
like you
era.
said, everybody had more time on their hands, right? And when you have more time on your hands, you try to figure out more things that kind of irritate you, right? Like, so those day to day things like, why does the twisty tie on the bread, like, why is it so hard to untwist?
Yeah.
Like, you try to untwist it and you've twisted it tighter. You've gone the wrong way. So you got to go back. And that's the kind of silly stuff that Seinfeld did for us.
You stole my
And
material.
yeah. But it was fun. It wasn't, you didn't have to think about it, right? It was just there and made you go,
Yeah.
yeah, what is with that? you know, the joke about it being about nothing is just that, but it works because
And
it's
it
about nothing.
and I think it really only could work in that era that Americans by and large had, and Western civilization in general had developed to a point where, all right, the pattern of our week has been laid out for us. We have a weekend, we have, the pattern of the day has been laid out for us. We have 9 to 5 for most people. You come home, you do these things, and so the time of the
Patterns. We
evening
like
that
patterns.
we love that, and had been established. And on top of that, we had a few generations of modern living, so that people like Seinfeld, all he has to do to make a joke is to point things out,
Mhm.
and just kind of give his ordinary person perspective on it. He's not being vulgar. He's not coming up with weirdo mentality on things, just, asking
He's
questions.
not
And
like Kennison screaming in your ear about things,
yeah, yeah, or Andrew Dice Clay being overly profane or anything like that. He's just, a guy on stage that, if he didn't have a microphone, if he wasn't on stage, he could easily just be, your friend that you chat with,
Mhm.
and
While you're waiting in line for a movie, just a stranger.
yeah.
Or
And
yeah,
so much of the program itself, it was really nice that, I mean, they probably could have done it without him being on stage at the beginning and end of every episode. He could have been Jerry Seinfeld, clerk at the grocery store who just happens, and spends time with his friends talking about this stuff. But they decided to make it a quasi, because it kicked off a whole era of comedians getting their own shows, but I can't
Mhm.
think of any other one that made them also a comedian on the show.
Right.
You think about like Roseanne, and her stand-up comedy, you can see it and
Made it
hear it
into the
inside
show,
Roseanne, but yeah, she's just
but
Roseanne
she wasn't a
Connor,
comedian in the
right?
show. Yeah.
And then later on, King of Queens, is Kevin James comedy stylings. You can always tell on programs that, especially in the first couple of seasons, on programs that have a stand-up comedian as their source material, because sometimes they end up doing bits. They incorporate
Yeah.
one of their stand-up
Yeah.
bits, because like Kevin James has a fun stand-up bit about an oscillating fan and trying to catch it on its next pass, and
Yeah.
they incorporate that into one of the episodes on a very hot day on the King of Queens.
I
And
feel like that was that way with Bernie Mac too, you know?
yeah, they would
Yeah.
just kind of utilize it. I mean, so the material is his normal stuff, but I think they took a nice and a very successful chance by saying, all right, he's going to be a comedian on the show. And so and so we get to
It's
see it
it's
inner
life
work.
imitating art, right? So
Yeah.
they start the show off with some of his act, and then they go to the show, and the show is what's providing him the material for his act. Like his life is providing him his material. So
Yeah.
it's almost like a circle, right? So like the show, we're getting his normal jokes and stuff, like you said, but as the viewer, we're going, oh, this is how he gets his material from his friends, his neighbor, the situations that he's in with his parents, all this different stuff. So it's like, yeah, it's meta, right? But at the same time, just enough believability to disconnect from going, okay, the show is just his jokes from
And I
stage.
think that's probably why they decided to make him a comedian on the show, because it would have
Yeah.
been, I don't think the show would have been nearly as successful or as funny if we didn't have that almost like dramatic irony of like, we know why he's joking the way he is. And after
Mm-hmm.
a while, it became very helpful, because especially now watching it in reruns, that which episode it is based on the stand-up.
Yeah.
So the opening, it's almost like an opening monologue. He starts talking
Yeah.
about trying, going and trying to get a table at a or going to the mall, or something like that, and you're like, oh, I think this is the parking garage one,
Yeah.
and then it is,
It's the setup. It's the setup to the punchline, right?
it
And
is.
then the show is the joke, and then that freeze frame at the end of every episode, that's when the punchline hits, right? So
Mhm. And then, yep, and they was a masterful show at having so many of the storylines arriving at the same place at the same time, which is also
Mhm.
part of the recipe of a solid joke, is that you really need to have all the pieces fall into place at one point. You can't, like, 3 minutes later, like, oh yeah, and he also had two left shoes on. It doesn't work that way. It has to all come together. And I think season 4 is probably my favorite season, not just on Seinfeld, but on most programs, because I think by season 3 or 4, they have all of the characters have been fully developed. They've gotten all those stories that you need to do
Mhm.
on every show. The stock market episode, and the getting a new job episode, and all
Yeah.
those storylines that are all done, and they can branch off into doing new things. And one of the reasons I like the entirety of season 4 answers this question that comes up next, is how was this made? And I don't know what's exaggerated or what's not, but essentially having NBC approach Jerry Seinfeld as, quasi-realistic Jerry Seinfeld, and say, we'd like to, we like your comedy, we'd like to develop a sitcom. And then having George Costanza, who is the more or less the Larry David character,
David. Yeah.
showing up and tagging along with Jerry, and then watching them develop the entire series. There's more than a few episodes in season 4 that don't deal with them writing the series, or we're talking to any of the NBC suits or anything like that. But there's, throughout it does give you a little bit of an idea of how Seinfeld came to be. And I think that it's an interesting, if nonetheless, but it also gives some insights into the business side of things that, we as viewers, in whether it be 1987 or 1997, are watching TV, and what we're watching for those 23 minutes is the product, in some cases, of years worth of work. And, so much stuff going on in the background that, most of the time we could really care less about. But with a show that is about just the minutia of life and the things here and there that happen, I think it was almost like a documentary that season was. It was a documentary about the show you're watching. And I thought that was pretty interesting. What do you make of that?
I lost you there. You lagged and froze.
Oh, geez, that's such a 2021 problem. Well, I was just saying that it's actually, I didn't have much to work with, so I'll just move on to the next thing on this one.
No,
it's fine. I was just saying about how season 4 is documentary-esque, because you get to see how
it really is, because like you said, and we of course we always kind of chat a little bit about what topics we're going to talk about next, and it's true. It's like that whole season pitching the show is a behind the scenes documentary of the show and how it got made, like you said. So you pitch it around Jerry's comedy, but ultimately it's a show about nothing, pitching a show about nothing.
Yeah.
About nothing.
And they prove
that it's about nothing. Yeah. This is a show. The lag, dropped phone calls.
Yeah.
That's a show. But it's like, but that's real, and that's what connects with people, right? It's not some exuberant plot that you have to explain for 2 weeks to get people on board with it, right? And it's not some cliffhanger that makes you go, oh, I got to wait till next week. What if they don't do this? What if they don't do that? That's where we get that water cooler talk for some shows, right? Like every week. Oh, did you see this show? Oh my God, what do you think is going to happen next? With Seinfeld, people still did that, but there was no cliffhanger, right? It was just like, oh my God, did you watch Seinfeld last night? Oh, I couldn't believe that bit. And everybody's spitting one-liners, right? Something Kramer did, something Newman did, or George said, Kramer answering the phone in Jerry's apartment saying, no, you got the wrong number. There's no Vandalay Industries. And George come running out of the bathroom with his pants down around his ankles. No. And Jerry going, and you want to be my latex salesman. Crazy stuff.
So I just, as a, for listeners, Kyle and I went to high school with each other, and I can be pretty sure I remember, little circles of, guys, predominantly guys, talking with and sharing those lines back and forth the next day, on a Friday morning, or
you're having lunch, right?
Yeah, and you'd have something to say, and especially, and I guess we could take a moment just real quick and skip down a little bit to who the intended audience was. I think, considering that all the characters on Seinfeld were late 30s New York singles, you would think,
and they tell us that in season 3 or season 4, Jerry says I'm 36.
Yeah, and so you're like, I always felt that much more kind of cool and mature that I was 14, 15, watching a show that wasn't really intended for me, but I got it enough that I could, share about it with my friends. Speaking of that word, friends, it's easy to argue that the TV show Friends would not have happened without Seinfeld.
If it weren't for Seinfeld. You think of all of the actors or actresses mostly that ended up on Seinfeld in those roles, like Lisa Kudrow. And
was she
Monica? What's her name?
I know Courtney Cox was on an episode of Seinfeld.
Courtney Cox,
with the
and I'm pretty sure. I mean, I'd have to look into it, and me, I'll fact check myself after I say things. But there was an episode where Kramer convinces George to park in a handicap space, and people are waiting. That the woman ends up getting hurt. She's in the hospital or whatever. Kramer goes to see her because he feels bad, falls in love, and says, "Hey, George, we need to buy her a new wheelchair.
Yeah.
She's got no wheelchair left." And they buy her a wheelchair, a used one.
That's right. Yep.
And by the end of the episode, she goes down the hill. And if you look real quick, man, that looks an awful lot like Lisa Kudrow.
Now that you mention it, it could very well be. I know that she was a strong contender for the role of Roz on Frasier, and she had already been. I forget exactly when Mad About You began, but she was on Mad About You, which actually brings up something else.
Which brings it full circle because she played her own sister.
So I wanted to talk about real quick with this, and I think it still falls under who's the intended audience or user of this, is that, without Seinfeld as the anchor, all of those other must-see TV show sitcoms, including Friends and Mad About You, probably would not have either existed, because they all based their, to one extent or another, their comedy on just, daily life, minutia, the relationship things, and, like certain characters, taking some of the same kinds of stances on things as the Seinfeld people, hanging out in coffee shops and chatting about life in general, and
nothing.
Exactly. Just nothing at all. And so, but I feel like Seinfeld, at the risk of almost coming off as conceited, never really involved themselves very much in the other shows. There's one that Blackout special, if you remember, they had a whole
series, the city of New York blacks out. Yes. And
it starts on Mad About You, because the characters in that show trip over something, or they pull, a fuse from the fuse box, and the whole city goes dark. And then it continued on to Friends, into one of the most iconic episodes of that show. And then it skipped over Seinfeld and was continued on another program after Seinfeld, which the slot after Seinfeld is always where they put stuff, like Caroline in the City, or in this particular case, God, it was a program called it was with Dabney Coleman, and it wasn't Evening Shade, but another short-lived show. But anyway, it was based on, so they based it all on that. But then, Seinfeld didn't take part, and to me, that was always the signal that they didn't see themselves as the same audience as the rest of must-see TV, that they had their own group, and that they kind of rose above gimmicky things like that.
They didn't need the gimmick.
They didn't need it, but they are in fact connected, because, the characters of, so you have Ursula and Phoebe, who are twin sisters, and Ursula works at the restaurant in Mad About You, and Phoebe is, one of the friends. And there's an episode where some of the characters from Mad About You show up into into Central Park, and they see Phoebe there, and they think it's Ursula. And
I vaguely remember that. Yes,
that whole thing goes down, which establishes, yes, these two shows are connected, even more so. There is an early episode of Mad About You where Paul Reiser's character runs into Jerry Seinfeld as Jerry Seinfeld, the comedian. And then it turns out later in that episode, and that Paul Reiser's character, I think was just Paul, who himself was another comedian, actually lived in Jerry's apartment. So he goes back to his old apartment to pick up, and Kramer comes out into the hallway. He's like, "Hey, how you doing? I haven't seen her." And they do some small talk for a little while and catch up. So that continues that thread. So technically, Mad About You and Seinfeld are in the same world. But then there's
we got them on a technicality here.
I did. I can totally show them that they weren't all that, because later on, George and his fiancée are shown at the end of the evening watching Mad About You, and they took a huge risk with season 4 by having them go to NBC, by having all those posters in the background of other shows from NBC, because if they saw themselves as, we're not an actual TV show, we are just, this is almost like reporting out from
This is
this
like
guy's
real life. Yeah.
daily life. That seems to be their intended audience, at least originally, was not necessarily New York singles, but just people in their, upper 30s with a bit of a more refined, sense of humor as far as like the observational type stuff. And yet they still just,
It's a dry palate, Eric. It's okay.
Yes.
You can say it. It's a dry palate. Yeah.
So I just wanted to point that out. And I think it really does speak to, as of the late 80s, early 90s, when Seinfeld came on, that was an audience that perhaps had been, maybe a bit forgotten about. The 80s were a whole era of family sitcoms, that it was, teaching life lessons by way of, modeling things, Growing Pains, The Cosby Show, even Roseanne being a family comedy show that started at the end of the 80s.
Yeah. And what's the one thing that was always there, right? There was like some weird moral, right? To everything. By the end of the episode, you've gotten this moment and this moral, and everything ends up happy-go-lucky at the end. And I think what I like and enjoy about Seinfeld, despite the fact that there is a laugh track and everything like that on it, right? There's still that things aren't always necessarily going to end up wholesome at the end of this, and things are resolved, and it might very well end up in more conflict. I'll never forget the episode where Elaine is having some auction for charity, and she's auctioning off dates with men. And she's like, Jerry, you should get a haircut. And his barber is horrible, Gino, right? It's horrible, but he's loyal. He doesn't want to hurt his feelings. And Kramer's like, well, it's his day off today. Go see his nephew. He's there by himself, and he gets this haircut, and it turns into this whole like twisted love affair, hiding, right? Trying to see the other barber behind his back. And by the end of it, Newman has gotten involved and really screwed Jerry over. And so Newman is pretending to be a barber, and Jerry shows up, and he's got the clippers, and he shaves Newman's head, and it's just that freeze thrown moment of poor Newman's terrified face.
And his screaming actually carries on after the freeze frame. You can hear him like, afterwards. So you can only imagine what's going on. And that is one of there's only a few examples, you're right, of like that kind of moral, justice showing up, and somebody getting, because so often on that show it just ended, and it just kind of, things arrived, and I know that the last episode, the series finale, got a lot of negative feedback, and I guess this would be a good segue to go back up to the question of who made it and what their role and status in society was. So Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld together worked on this as both comedians and writers. Like Larry David worked for SNL for a brief time and a few other programs as a comedy writer. He was on Seinfeld, and he wrote some of the most well-regarded episodes of that show for about 6 seasons, and then left. Larry David did, but only he came back to help write the last episode. And a lot of people were upset about that last episode. They're like, what the heck? It was so weird. It wasn't Seinfeld-esque. It was so ridiculous, with them going into, an international flight and then getting arrested for some, Good Samaritan law that they didn't do. And I was like, but isn't this exactly bringing it back home to, in so many ways? Because not only is the last line from that episode the first line from the first episode about the placement of George's buttons on his shirt, but it's like these people didn't learn anything, because it's not that kind of show. They're just
right.
So in some ways it brought the whole show back around to its original, because by that point some of the episodes got pretty silly. George or Jerry thinking he was turning into a werewolf or something, and he shaved his chest.
That's
right. And he was,
because this girl he was dating didn't like hairy men.
Yeah.
So he shaved his chest, and they were on this bus trip, and it was growing back, and he was just itching him, and I couldn't stand it anymore. So he finds this moment, and he gets off the bus, and it's nighttime, and he
Yeah.
busts open his shirt and just starts
And
scratching
it's
and howling
howling.
at the
Yeah.
moon.
And they're funny in their own part, but then based on when you think about some of those earlier episodes, like, they I don't know if they ever jumped the shark, but they, weren't quite what they once were. And I think the Larry David
Kramer
leaving
drink.
the writing and producing side really showed itself in those later
Kramer
seasons.
cooking himself on the roof in butter.
Yeah, I mean,
So he
funny
smells
stuff.
like
You know, it's
turkey.
that's right.
And then there's that hallucination of him with the turkey.
That's right. Hey,
And
buddy.
yeah, so you're right. Like it did kind of switch these gears a little bit later towards the end. And that's when right?
Yeah.
That's when you've hit your limit. You've had enough to drink, and you got to cut yourself off.
And I think they realized it too, and that's why they didn't push it any further into the. Imagine if Seinfeld into the new millennium. So the next question is, and I'll put them together. So those two guys are the core as far as the makers of it. What is their role or status in society? So they're both stand-up comedians, comedy writers, known for their observational humor. What does that tell you about the late 1980s and throughout the 90s, that somebody could make a living off of, making comments about everyday life? I mean, and not just a living, I mean, a really good living. What does that tell you about?
And I mean, and some still today. I mean, Jerry's still got his niche, but as far as the time frame, like, so you look at your George Carlins and your Andrew Dice Clays and your Kennisons and all those things that we talked about before, like shock comments, right?
Yeah.
They had their place. That there was a societal change, there was uproar and unrest and protesting and all this different stuff. So it was like, yeah, we're gonna do that in our own way, right? We're gonna do it in a very shocking way that makes people go, oh, kind of like burning bras, right?
Mm.
But when you get to the late 80s and the 90s, it's different, right? A lot of that's kind of mellowed out and fizzled.
Yeah.
Like it's that civil unrest is still there, but it's not as rampant and as wild a fire as it had been during other generations. So what do comedians talk about, right? There's nothing really you can shock people with anymore. We've lived through wars and decades of oppression and this, now, whatever. Now we're in this boom of society and technology and everything else. What do we talk about?
It's true.
What, like they do. They talk about everyday stuff. Like I said at the beginning of with the twisty ties with the bread.
Yeah.
Or like for us right now, like you see things like a USB cord only goes in one way.
Yeah.
You got a 50% chance of getting it right. You get it wrong 100% of the time. What's with that, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's what people connected with during that time. And I mean, people still connect with that kind of material today. It's just different, coming from different people. But that was the norm then. Like everybody was calm and just worried about everyday things. Nobody was worried about having to hide under your desk because of a nuclear bomb going off.
Yeah.
The Cold War was over,
Yeah. No, I think it's very, it's definitely telling of the time period that, like we were saying before about Jerry himself, his style of comedy, it does go, even though the things he talks about are modern and, things relevant mainly to 80s and 90s audiences, his style of comedy, just his overall appearance, is very classic looking and sounding. He doesn't, like you said, he's not a shock comedy guy. He rarely gets, any language in his routines. He's almost like a grown-up boy in some ways, always eating his cereal and talking about Superman, and just kind of has,
exactly.
I don't want to be a pirate, and some of the, all these things like that is, little kid-esque, and kind of like that's part of his charm. And I've always seen him and people like him as like ordinary guy just kind of reporting out, debriefing the day, and think about the way he throughout the series, Jerry's wardrobe is the most plain, intentionally
Oh
plain,
yeah,
like just
jeans,
polo
a button-up
shirts.
shirt,
Yeah, sometimes a
sports coat,
turtleneck,
maybe
solid
sneakers.
color. And
And he always wore sneakers, even though he refused to race.
that's right. That's right. Kind of like just holding on to the, one sign to show, that no pun intended being Seinfeld, but showing that, yeah, I'm a comedy guy. I have sneakers on,
Yeah.
Kramer was, they call him a hipster doofus, throughout the series. And I think he's sort of meant to be the holdover of that era that you were referring to. He's the 80s, the 70s kind of guy of
self-employed, high
yeah,
school equivalency.
and so I think this as well as who it's being made for does say also about the demographics shifting throughout the 80s and 90s of the reason why so much of their life was relatable, even if you didn't live in New York City, was that people were waiting much longer to have families, to because like throughout, and he doesn't ever get, the closest he ever gets to getting married, there's a couple times like I think it's the one, to his parents, but
he was waiting
never,
for himself to come along. Yeah,
right, yeah, and he's still just I like dating, it's and that was becoming more and more relatable to people. A show about a bachelor would not have done very well in the 1950s when marriage happened sometimes right after high school.
Well, and even not just Jerry in the show. Look at Elaine, career woman.
Yeah.
Wasn't worried about getting married or even really commitment. Sometimes she'd fall in love and have repeating relationships. We all remember Putty.
Yeah.
Right. But that was different too, right? Than those previous generations. Now we've got a single woman living on her own in New York City. All of her friends are male. She works at a publishing firm.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very, and again, it wasn't shoved in the viewer's face, looking for that to be a discussion topic. It was because they knew there were other Elaines out there who could relate. And that, because she wasn't even an original cast member. It was, when you watch those first couple episodes, you get the feeling that the waitress at the coffee shop is being, they're trying to warm her into the viewers, to being like, yeah, she's going to be, because she adds a few quips here and there as she comes back and forth to the table. And, you get the sense that she's meant to be one of the, the female
part of the show.
Which would you say that the show was more like, would the audience be more male or female centric because of that, because of the 3-to-1 ratio of men versus women?
Yeah, see, that's a tough one. I mean, you would think, right, that the heads of NBC and stuff would be like, hey, we got a lot of demographics watching shows that are female on Thursday nights. Let's get some men watching too and increase that viewership. And so Seinfeld comes across as this funny, silly man show, right?
Yeah.
But I know personally that I have so many female friends that religiously watch the show too. So I think the idea was to get more male viewership, but through some weird dynamic, and having the Elaine character be such a strong character in the show. Julia Louis-Dreyfus is an amazing actress, and she commands the screen when she's on it, especially with those scenes where she's screaming "get out" at people and pushing them backwards.
Her physical comedy is, I think, not paid attention to enough. I mean, she doesn't do the pratfalls like Kramer does, but I love the way she over exaggerates with her
Oh, when she
hands
gets
in
bit by the dog in the glasses store,
her
she gets bit by that dog, and she's like, "Oh my God, I'm bleeding!" And she
yeah,
like has to like
hobble
crawl
out.
her way out of the store. And Jerry's just being nonchalant, like, "Yeah, I'll get a taxi or whatever." And she's holding the door for him while she's like trying to keep the blood from coming out of her leg.
I've been rewatching, and I've been watching a lot of shows and rewatching them. One of the luxuries we have, but it's not it's more luxurious now because we have streaming and on demand. It was,
I
even
still own
while,
it all on DVD, so
right,
it's
DVD, and
fine.
before
Yeah.
that I used to tape episodes of Seinfeld
Hmm.
so that I could watch them later, and they were on syndication all the time. So, I could rewatch them at will and at my own leisure. But when I rewatch them again, this one and the King of Queens is one that I go back through, and when I pay more attention to characters like Elaine, or on the King of Queens like Carrie, I'm like, they actually own this show. They have some of the funniest lines and the
Mm.
best facial expressions, because the King of Queens similarly is predominated by male characters. The only
Hmm.
they do bring in a few more female characters later on in that series, more so than Seinfeld ever does. Because Seinfeld just had a rotating number of
Oh yeah, Jerry's
or
girlfriends
Jerry
or
and
George's
George,
girlfriends. Yeah.
that they could interact with. But the getting that female perspective and watching their expressions on their face, or like the snide little comments that they give back to the men, I think they're like the voice of the women in the audience, being like, yeah, these guys are being too selfish, or they're being too much like guys. We got to keep them in check a little bit. So thank you, Elaine, for pointing that out. And continue on. But
Yeah,
she
but
has
then,
some of the
well,
best
she
lines.
also gets these ridiculous moments and I go back to that episode I just referenced with the dog bite, where she starts to think that she has rabies, and then Kramer's like, "Yeah, you've got rabies. My friend
Joe,
had that before, and she like
Joe
can't
Sacamano.
swallow, so she goes over and she takes a drink of water and she just starts foaming at the
Yeah,
mouth, and it's just this moment, and she gets so excited and irritable, and her just like her comedic presence mixed in with the physical comedy as well. It takes her out of that role of just being that female balance and makes her a main character. Like you
yeah.
said, she owns it, and I don't think her any less than any of the other three characters that are on that show ever.
No, they did a nice job throughout the series of balancing out the storylines, so that,
Hmm.
and they had a nice, round number of main characters that they could easily coordinate especially if you stuck two of them together, you
Hmm.
could coordinate a couple, an A story and a B story, maybe a C one, just to throw it in there. I
The
one of my
party,
one of
right?
my favorite Elaine moments is just a little, it's like a tiny second. It's when they go to the beach house in the Hamptons, and
Oh, yeah.
George is explaining to Jerry his predicament that he's in,
He was
for
in the pool.
swimming,
Yeah.
and you see Elaine just like sauntering by in the background, and just like her cadence, like just the way she's like swinging her arms back and forth, just like doop-a-doo, and then like Jerry calls her
Something
in,
catches her ear.
and she like, oh, and stops, and kind of peers back in. It's so like early Hollywood, like it looks like it's something out of the 20s. I really,
Vaudeville.
it's such a, yeah, and she has that style about her, and she was on SNL for a short while in the 80s, and has a lot of improv comedy background to her. So that was, I'm sure, intentional. I just, for some reason, that little clip always stands out to me, and I think that's a good way to bring it to the next question: is why did they make it? You touched on a few minutes ago the idea of it being made because of a gap in shows for that demographic of men age
Yeah.
eight, and it's funny to say that there's how why is there, because it seems like everything else is made for males age 14 to or 18 to 45. You would think that, primetime television would also be, made for them, but you
Well, I
think
think
that,
I think Seinfeld was at a time where things were changing, right? So you mentioned Cheers. That's the older demographic, right? People have been
yeah,
watching that for forever, and that demographic was getting older, right? The people that loved that show, that started on that show, um, weren't 36 anymore.
right,
uh, and you talk about Friends and Mad About You and some of these Caroline in the City, all these different shows. I really don't think that the goal is to have a spread demographic, but I think a majority, again, fact check me, listeners, please. But I think the viewers are predominantly female at that time, because you had your dramas on after that too. You had your ERs, your Law and Orders, all those different things. And what better way to get that 30 something male crowd in there than with a 30 something comic, right?
right.
Men love stand up comedy. It's hilarious. We love going to comedy shows. And then you have a hit on your hands that makes it big, So it's hard to say who Jerry made that show for. Outside of himself, maybe.
I think
whether it was for the men or for the women, or whether it was for everybody. But
well,
I think when the NBC
a,
execs come in, what are they saying? They're going, "Hey, this is an opportunity for us to increase our male viewership."
And I think that's where the character of George, the Larry David inspired character of George comes in, because not that any of the guys on Seinfeld are studs necessarily, but between Jerry is better looking, he's cleaner, he's successful, he has money,
he's confident, always dating someone new.
Kramer is fun and quirky and charming.
Kavorka.
George,
he has the Kavorka. Wild, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
George is a lovable loser. He's neurotic. He gets out of his.
He's a 40 short. He's bald.
Yeah, he's not
no job. Lives with his parents.
He is, the ultimate. And so I think that character, that particular character, is perhaps why this show was made. And I mean, he's not quite that bad in the first couple episodes. They kind of make him a little bit cooler, and he's giving Jerry advice.
But over the course of the show, he becomes more and more neurotic.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, I don't know if I said in the podcast, when I remember watching it when I was younger, and I didn't like George at all. But since then, and I've gone through my 30s, and I'm like, this is the best character on the show. He's the most relatable one because the kinds of stuff that he does and says, and the way he thinks, his thought process, I think, is shared by so many of us who consider ourselves, kind of average guys, that we're not,
I think one of my favorite George moments has always been the marine biologist episode.
Yeah.
Where Jerry runs into this girl from college and she asks about George, and he goes, yeah, he's actually a pretty successful marine biologist. He's working on whales, trying to lower their cholesterol. And then George goes, a marine biologist? Why? I've always wanted to pretend I was an architect.
He's like,
I don't know anything about whales.
He is,
and you got me living with the turtles, for God's sakes. But that's such a good moment of defining George. He's always trying to pretend he somebody that he's not, because he doesn't feel successful at who he is.
That monologue,
he feels he's more successful at being something he's not than being who he is.
Right. And he's like, it's not a lie if you believe it.
It's right.
And of all the characters, he seems to kind of maintain his, because by the end of the series, all of them had just become more or less just the, consumed by one trait. Kramer was always falling down over things, and Jerry was beyond selfish by the end of the series. And Elaine, it seemed like as soon as her hairstyle changed, she became just mean all the time and vindictive. And it seems like George, because he started out being so shallow and ridiculous, it works out well that he kind of stays that way he stays consistent through most of the series.
It stays that way even when it's working for the Yankees.
So and even takes that for, and that's the kind of thing that the show, if it was any lesser of a show, that would have seemed like a weird, very almost like jumping the shark moment of taking one of the characters and putting them onto a Major League Baseball team. But the episode where he gets that interview for the job of The Opposite is one of the best written TV shows, because it's like, by this point we know this character very well, and each of the situations that
opposite of everything that I'd ever would have done.
It's so great because it makes you think of yourself like, oh, okay, if that situation came up for me, should I listen to the opposite instead of doing what would be, because it's fun watching him like in the movie theater and those guys are being loud. It's like, we've never seen George in that situation before he decided to be the opposite, but we see him now doing it. And so you get almost a laugh thinking about, having this eureka moment, George reacting to those guys and what would have happened to him then. He probably would have just been like, yeah, let's go home, or, he just, deal with it. But the way he gets up and, it's like, oh, okay. I can get along with this George, but that only happens once you know the guy. And, getting to know a character like that is definitely because of a pattern that every Thursday night people were watching their TV show and then on Friday morning talking about it around the water fountain or otherwise. So I pulled up the
or top lunch table.
That's right, over a blue lunch table that is either round or rectangular.
That's right.
And fudge rounds that were 50 cents. Top rated US TV television programs from the 88-89 season, which is just before Seinfeld. And the Seinfeld Chronicles, strangely, they premiered on July 5th. I think it's a weird, now we're not so surprised with shows premiering in the summertime, but that's not very common for that era. The day after the 4th of July to premiere a show.
It had to be in the fall. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a weird thing, but it premiered then. But so number one in that 88-89 season was Cosby Show. Roseanne, A Different World, which was a offshoot of the Cosby Show. Cheers, 60 Minutes. I guess I'll just stick to the sitcoms. Golden Girls, Who's the Boss? Empty Nest, which I'm surprised it broke the top 10.
Oh my God.
That was like a Saturday show. It was weird.
Yeah.
And that was related to the Golden Girls. And a bunch of them. So I think you're right. I think that says something, that there is a demographic. I mean, Cheers sort of catered to that group, but it's
an aging population, and they moved on with Frasier, right?
Right. And that's one of my other all-time favorite shows is Frasier.
Yeah.
Because I think they did such, amazing things with a character that really was not the centerpiece of the show Cheers. And yet
they could have gone so many different ways with that. I mean, they could have gave Norm his own show.
Yeah.
But it still would have been at Cheers. So
exactly. And we can put a pin in Frasier for a little bit and talk about him another time.
But
I think that's a worthy topic as well. But
challenge accepted.
Yes. And, I'll bring some tossed salad and scrambled eggs for that one. So I think we talked pretty much about, the intended audience. I do have a question here of where was it made? I always find it funny that so many shows are set in New York, but they're filmed in LA. It's
Monk's Diner, that outside shot, that's an LA thing.
Well, I think the diner is in New York, but Jerry's apartment's in LA. That outdoor establishing shot that they always show of his apartment. I remember watching a kind of underwhelming story of Seinfeld a couple years after it went off the air, but that was one of the few things that he pointed out, because you see him standing there and he's pointing up. He's like, "That was my apartment for 9 years, but this is actually in such and such street in LA," and it's nowhere near New York. And I guess it's like one of those powers of television. that,
behind the
so
scenes on VH1, right?
yeah,
Behind the scenes. Yeah.
so the where was it made component, in those days, like the 80s and 90s or so long ago,
Oh God, they
Los
were.
Angeles was that was, where all shows were made. There was no question about it that if you were going to make
Mhm.
a TV program, it was going to be recorded in LA. That's where all the actors lived. That's where all the directors, everybody was there. So it just proves that that was still the case. Yet everybody across the country, I mean, we can talk about this on just talking about the audio. We can do it without visuals at all because everyone was watching Seinfeld. It
Yeah.
wasn't something that we have to explain. Like, I don't have to get my a camera out and be like, okay, I got to record some of this program of Seinfeld because it was a regional hit. It was only,
Right.
in one section of the country. It was broadcast nationwide, for almost 10 years. And, it really, and even if you were not living in New York at the time, everybody found something that could be had. Now, what's interesting is I don't believe, and I could be wrong about this, Seinfeld is not a show that I think got a lot of attention much beyond the United States. I know other shows have, like Frasier and Friends have pretty big fandoms in the United Kingdom, but I don't know if Seinfeld really does.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that myself either. But if I were to ponder on it, culturally speaking, there isn't much about Seinfeld that I think translates very well outside of the United
Yeah.
States. I mean, Frasier, yeah, Cheers, yeah. There's something there that could switch over and could be translated to other
Yeah. I
cultures. But
mean,
like
Cheers is a pub. That's,
Seinfeld, yeah, but Seinfeld, I mean, at times, even during the series, it pokes fun at the fact that really they're not really all that culturally
yeah.
integrated. Like, I think about that episode where we're introduced to the character Babu from Pakistan, and he has his multicultural restaurant
Yeah.
across the street from his
What's it called
apartment.
again? It's like,
Um,
oh shoot.
I forget what the name of it is, but like he serves Italian, Mexican,
Is it the
all,
Rainbow
French
Cafe
food,
or something like
everything.
that? Or
Yeah.
yeah.
And Jerry's like, hey, you should just do your own native food. Like,
Mhm.
there's no Pakistani restaurants around here. You should do that. And he's like, okay,
And then it goes under. I
fail.
mean, yeah.
Right. And Jerry just thinks so highly of himself because he's helping someone out. Right. And there's a lot of moments like that. I was talking to you about the episode where he gets really super excited that Elaine's having a poker game, and this woman Winona is going to be there. And Winona is a Native American, and he buys a cigar Indian for Elaine and brings it over, and he's just,
Yeah.
like, hi, 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 and Elaine's like, are you crazy?
Yeah.
So there's all these different things of like, those are really kind of jokes based on American people
Right.
living in American culture. And do other people find it funny? Can they relate to it? I
Yeah.
don't know. So yeah,
So
that's my
I guess
understanding of that.
yeah, and I think that's a good point, and one that reveals that, because this show did come out pre-internet,
Mm-hmm.
and it went off the air in the early days of commercial internet, and so therefore regular global, the idea of the globe shrinking and us being able to get to know each other. I mean, the transatlantic flights and phone calls were not out of the question, definitely by the 1980s, but the
No, we all
idea
saw Home
of,
Alone, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
but having a
To plug
shared
another episode, listeners, to plug another episode.
a shared a shared culture and pop culture between the different, it's almost like that was, Seinfeld came out right at the edge of that it was, this is how the United States is developing our society as of the late 1980s. And now, throughout the 90s is when the world really starts to shrink. And,
Mm-hmm.
so therefore, but like you said, it's what the Seinfeld cast goes through throughout the series are things that are almost, exclusively American. It's really not like, and one of the reasons why I don't think the show would really come out the same way if it was made now,
Right.
if they,
I agree. Yeah.
it's a,
Not, not that there's anything wrong with that.
no, not that there's anything wrong with that. I think we covered the next question already in a lot of different ways. The second to last question is, what ideas or behavior does this convey of making a series like this and having it last for as long as it lasted? I think we did a pretty decent job, pretty thorough of touching on.
Yeah, just insert everything. Go back and listen to this again
Right.
to answer that question. Right.
It's it has so much of an impact, and I don't think that they realized what kind of hit they had on their hands when the show came together originally. I don't think that and I think some of the choices that they made throughout the series reflected that a little bit, because in the first season in particular, there's a lot of long, drawn out dialogues between characters. There's that one with Jerry and Elaine talking about in there and out here, and it just goes on and on and on.
You got to have, yeah.
And by
the best of both worlds.
By the end of the series, they were doing smash cuts and 10-second long scenes, and just really moving the show along very quickly. It became a lot more colorful. It was, they integrated more, for better or for worse, they integrated more of like Kramer's zany antics, driving the back of a fire truck and, rush hour traffic.
Or him and Newman trying to make more money returning the bottles to
right.
using the mail truck. Yeah.
that kind of stuff.
Or Kramer adopting a part of the highway and making the first class lanes, the comfort lanes.
I do like that.
I
think about that all the time whenever and again, I go back to Elaine's line in that she ends up being like a custodian, and because she's trying to get the Chinese food delivered. And so she makes this, but then at the end of that, whenever I'm driving on a road that the lanes are not, ironically, E-lane are, the lanes are gone, they haven't repainted them yet. I'm like, oh, how luxurious, because she starts to weave around the road, because they have erased the lines.
Because you have room. I think just to quickly add something in contrast to your point about the times where they had like these long drawn out conversations and how they moved into quicker, snappier bits. I do recall at one point you telling me one of your favorite episodes is when Kramer goes out to LA.
Yeah.
And that's a long bit. They do that whole Mulholland Drive murder thing. Yeah. I think there are times where it works and times where it doesn't.
What I like about that one is because they're out of their element, and that's always fun. Mm-hmm. I mean, which is actually funny because they were very much in their element because they filmed the show right there in Hollywood.
Yeah, exactly.
But, they had to pretend that they were traveling and that's what makes that fun. I guess what I mean is in the first season or so when they have, just such long dialogues about relationship-y stuff, and it was in that era, it was definitely catering directly to people in their mid-30s who are single and on the dating scene, whereas it didn't take long before they started saying, and maybe somebody, one of the NBC executives said, need more stories that can draw in middle America too. Like, they're not so interested in what it's like to be a Manhattan single scene member. Maybe you can draw in broader stories that are applicable to others.
Kramer burning himself on coffee. Yeah.
So that kind of instant feedback is also something very of the time period of Nielsen ratings and TV Guide reporting back out to speaking of TV Guide, that's another great episode. So the last question is this prescriptive or descriptive? And I think that, most of the time art in all its forms, whether it's a sitcom or a song or whatever, is usually prescriptive. It wants you to think a certain way about a subject. But that is the beauty of Seinfeld, is that it's actually pretty descriptive. It just kind of describes life back to us. So it's art reflecting reality, and then reality reflecting off of art once again. And so in so many circumstances, the reason why we laugh so hard is because they're giving us a relatable situation right back to us. And, like,
that's comedy. Yeah. That's what comedy does.
The best kind too. You don't need, wacky stories. You can. And so I think that is the answer. And it goes back to what we were saying before about, people in the 80s, there was enough modern life had happened by the late 80s, early 90s, that there was always somebody out there.
It was time to complain about
right, exactly. Stuff. Finally we have enough that we can, we talk about first world problems, right? Like
world problems. That's right, what they are now.
She had man hands. We're like,
I've never broken up with somebody for not eating apple pie before.
Exactly.
I've broken up with someone for not offering me pie before.
the problems of the leisure class, when you have a growing, just most of the country falling into the category of a leisure class, people that have so much time on their hands that they can watch a show which is like a reflection of their everyday life in some way or another, is very telling of the time period.
And by Thursday, you needed it.
Definitely, because that time of the week, I still hold Thursdays, during the work week, as right now it's vacation time, so it's not the same, but I still hold Thursdays as like my favorite day of the week, because it's, even though I have total choice as to what I watch now, I don't have to watch. That being said, I still put on America's Funniest Home Videos on Sundays. I don't really watch that show on any other night.
Thursdays for me is always karaoke night, you see.
Yeah. so it's it is a great night for whether it's singing off of a computer screen or watching reruns of Seinfeld. It brings you back. It's almost like we were programmed to think of the week that way. It's like I can see the week as every time a new one starts, it's like, all right, if I can just get to Thursday, the rest of it just rolls off, so well that if Thursday night, if I can get to that point and laugh and, unwind a little bit, Friday is a cinch.
It's halfway down the hump.
Then you're in the weekend. And this reminds me, this shows us how much Seinfeld's impacted our lives, of the episode where he and Elaine go down to visit his parents in Florida. And he breaks down. He's like, "Oh, it's most of the day is going to be travel, and then you sleep. It's really only half a day, the way.
Jerry, my back, I can't sleep on that couch anymore.
It's so hot in here." Another great Elaine story. I think she.
Absolutely.
Maybe they should have called the show Bennies, instead of Seinfeld.
Well, I do recall she did have her own show after.
That's true. She had a couple of them, didn't she? The New Adventures of Old Christine.
Successful, I don't believe. And I think that's one of the things that. Let's see. George, some bit parts and movies and stuff after that.
Yeah, but even before that, there's a great episode of Seinfeld where he watches Pretty Woman that I got a kick out of, because the actor was in that, and so it's kind of a meta. Thing. And
hey, listen, I implore the listeners, if they haven't, they've been living under a rock since the 90s and haven't seen an episode of Seinfeld, please let me go ahead and take some free promotion to Netflix to go ahead and try and watch some of that.
I was gonna say, I think that they made a good choice by putting that onto their, and
Netflix, if you're listening.
Oh, they are.
Yeah. We got some more to talk about if you want to reach out and
if they can just put the Mortal Kombat movie on there, then they're all set with us.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people that have never watched an episode of Seinfeld, younger people in particular, and hopefully it being on such easy access on Netflix will change that, because I think they are missing out, because it's a perfect primary source of the time period in which it came out, and then it continued to influence society and culture.
Other primary sources,
so many other ones would not have come to be throughout the 90s and beyond had it not been for that. I think about so many of those other shows, like Ellen DeGeneres had a sitcom for a little while that was similar model. It was a bunch of friends, singles hanging out and chatting. And while they definitely also derived a lot of ideas from Friends, I mean, the original TV show Ellen was on was called These Friends of Mine. And the opening sequence of that show looked a lot like Friends. They're all sitting on a couch in the middle of nowhere, watching a TV. And
how generous.
Right. Ha 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 ha. That's awesome. Well, I think that's a sign that we should probably wrap things up.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate you once again coming on board and talking about this. And hopefully we can get some more Seinfeldians out there if there aren't already existing. But thanks again, and I hope that you.
Hey, I always have a blast chatting with you, Eric.
I really appreciate it, and I appreciate all of you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything, including the TV series Seinfeld, is a primary source. We'll see you next time.